Story: struggling single dad mocked for inheriting junk farmhouse until the $120 million secret was uncovered. The alarm wasn't a gentle chime or a soothing melody. It was a shrill electronic scream that clawed Alex Evans from the depths of a sleep too short and too shallow to be called rest. 4:30 a.m. The numbers on the cheap digital clock glowed a vicious red in the pre-dawn gloom of the tiny bedroom. For a moment, he lay still, listening to the two sounds that defined his world: the frantic buzzing of the alarm and the soft, rhythmic breathing of his daughter, Lily, asleep in her small bed across the room. Every muscle in his 5-year-old body felt twice its age, protesting as he swung his legs over the side of the bed. The linoleum floor was ice cold against his bare feet, a daily shock to the system that served as a second alarm. He moved with the practiced silence of a man terrified of waking his child, his shadow a gaunt figure dancing on the peeling paint of the apartment walls. The first job of the day was at a downtown diner, a place that perpetually smelled of stale coffee and hot grease. He was a line cook. By 5:15 a.m., he was standing over a sizzling griddle, a soldier in a war against morning hunger. The orders came in a relentless staccato rhythm from the waitresses. 2 over easy. Side of bacon, crisp it up. Pancake stack, hold the butter. Scramble 3, burn the toast. Alex moved like an automaton, his hands a blur of motion, cracking eggs, flipping bacon, plating hash browns. There was no art to it, no passion. It was a mechanical process fueled by the need to make rent. The heat was a physical presence wrapping around him, soaking his thin uniform with sweat. His boss, a portly man named Sal, barked orders more than he spoke them. "Evans, pick up the pace. Table 4's been waiting 5 minutes." Alex just nodded, his face a mask of weary compliance, and moved faster. He was good at his job, efficient, fast, and invisible. The perfect employee for a place that sold sustenance, not experiences. By 2 p.m., his shift was over. He didn't linger. He took the city bus, the squeal of its brakes a sigh of relief, and rode 40 minutes to the other side of town. He'd doze, his head knocking against the vibrating window, for what felt like seconds before his stop arrived. His second job was a stark contrast. The warehouse was a vast, cold, and cavernous space on the industrial outskirts of the city. The air smelled of cardboard and cold steel. Here, he wasn't a cook. He was a human forklift, a stalker for an online retail giant. From 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., he walked miles of concrete floor, lifting, scanning, and shelving boxes. The work was lonely and physically punishing. It was a silent, grinding toil, the only sounds being the beep of his scanner and the low hum of the fluorescent lights high above. The ache that started in his lower back would spread up his spine and down his legs until every step was a conscious effort. He thought of Lily to get through it. Her smile was the fuel that kept his legs moving when all they wanted to do was buckle. It was almost midnight when he finally turned the key in the lock of his own apartment. He stepped inside, and the crushing weight of the outside world was replaced by a different kind of pressure. The profound, heart-wrenching love for the small person who depended on him for everything. He tiptoed into their shared bedroom. Lily was fast asleep, her small chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. One arm was thrown over her head, her face a perfect portrait of innocence. On his own pillow, she had left a gift. It was a drawing made with the bright, bold strokes of a 7-year-old. It depicted 2 stick figures. One was tall, labeled Daddy. The other was small, labeled Lily. They were holding hands in front of a giant, sun-yellow house with a pointy red roof and a sprawling green lawn. Both stick figures had massive, smiling faces. Alex picked up the drawing, his calloused fingers tracing the crayon lines. A lump formed in his throat. This was her dream. A big house with a yard. A simple, fundamental childhood dream that, to him, felt as unattainable as a trip to the moon. He was building her a world out of scraps and exhaustion, and he feared it would never be enough. He gently folded the drawing and tucked it into his wallet, a sacred relic, before collapsing onto his bed, too tired to even change his clothes. Sleep, however, refused to come. The numbers swirled in his head. Rent, $1,250 a week late. Electricity, $112. Final notice. Car payment, $230, 2 weeks late. The numbers were a pack of wolves, nipping at his heels, threatening to tear him down. Defeated, he rose and walked to the small kitchen. There, on the corner of the counter, sat the enemy, a stack of small rectangular tyrants. The mail. He sifted through it under the dim, flickering light of the single bulb above the sink. A credit card offer, a pizza coupon, and then the bills. One after another, their clear plastic windows revealed angry, blood-red ink. Past due, final notice. Disconnection, imminent. He laid them out on the table, a tarot reading of his own financial doom. The total was a mountain he couldn't climb. For a long moment, he just stared, the paper swimming before his tired eyes. He put his head in his hands, the rough texture of his work pants pressing against his forehead. The feeling was suffocating. It was a deep, dark well of despair, and he was at the bottom of it, with no rope and no light. He had failed. He was failing Lily. His hand brushed against the last envelope at the bottom of the pile. It was different. While the others were flimsy and printed with aggressive marketing, this one was made of thick, cream-colored paper. It felt heavy, important. In the top left corner, an embossed seal read, Holloway, Finch, and Associates, attorneys at law. His heart gave a nervous flutter. Lawyers? What could they possibly want with him? He hadn't done anything wrong, had he? Was he being sued? Was he being evicted? With trembling fingers, he carefully tore it open. The paper inside was just as heavy, the text printed in a formal, somber font. He scanned the dense legal paragraphs, his mind struggling to comprehend the jargon. Dear Mr. Alexander Evans, it began. His eyes jumped from phrase to phrase. Regret to inform you, passing of your grandfather, Mr. Thomas Evans. Grandfather Thomas. The name felt alien on his tongue. He was a phantom, a man Alex hadn't seen since he was a toddler. His parents had spoken of him in hushed, disapproving tones, a recluse, an eccentric who had cut himself off from the family decades ago to live in some rural backwater. Alex had no memory of his face, only the faint, inherited family narrative of a strange old man. He kept reading, his breath caught in his chest. Last will and testament. Named you as the sole beneficiary, as his only living direct descendant. Sole beneficiary? Of what? The man was a hermit. Alex pictured a dusty savings account with a few $100s in it, maybe an old watch. But the next line made his blood run cold. Hereby bequeath the entirety of his estate, consisting of the property located at 14 Willow Creek Road, including the farmhouse and all accompanying land. A farmhouse. Land. The words seemed to lift off the page. He read the sentence again, then a third time, making sure his exhausted mind wasn't playing tricks on him. An image of Lily's drawing flashed in his mind, the big house, the green yard. A wave of dizziness washed over him. He sank into a kitchen chair, the letter shaking in his hand. He had no idea what this meant. For all he knew, the farmhouse was a collapsed ruin on an acre of weeds, burdened with back taxes that would sink him even further into debt. The family had always referred to it as that old junk farm, but as he sat there, in the suffocating silence of his tiny apartment, surrounded by the ghosts of his failures, the letter represented something he hadn't had in years. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was too fragile, too unknown for that. It was a door, a dusty, creaking, and possibly locked door standing in the middle of a barren field. He had no idea what was on the other side. It could be a cliff's edge. But it was, without a doubt, a way out of this room. The letter wasn't a promise of salvation. It was simply a different kind of unknown. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough. Sleep did not come easy that night. The lawyer's letter sat on the kitchen table like a strange, alien artifact. Alex lay in bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, his mind a frantic storm of questions. A farmhouse. Land. The words were an impossible dream. A cruel joke played by a universe that had, until now, shown him nothing but indifference. By morning, a fragile, terrified resolve had taken root. This wasn't a dream. He had to know more. His first call was to the law firm. A paralegal with a crisp, professional voice confirmed the details. The property was fully paid off. There were no outstanding liens or taxes. It was his, free and clear. The news should have been a relief, but it only deepened the mystery. Why would a man who had intentionally estranged himself from his entire family leave his only asset to a grandson he didn't know? My parents. They always said he was, Alex began, his voice trailing off. Reclusive, the paralegal offered, a hint of practiced sympathy in her tone. Mr. Evans was a very private man. His instructions were simple and direct. The property and its contents belong to you. That is all the information we have. Hanging up, Alex felt more unmoored than ever. He needed a face to put to the name, a tangible piece of this phantom grandfather. He remembered a dusty cardboard box shoved in the back of his closet, a sad little collection of family memorabilia he'd taken after his parents moved to a retirement community in Florida. He pulled it out, the scent of aging paper and mothballs filling the small room. Inside were his own school photos, Lily's first baby shoes, and a handful of old albums. He flipped through pages of smiling, unfamiliar relatives from a bygone era, and then he found it. Tucked into the back sleeve of an album was a single, loose photograph, its edges curled and yellowed with age. It was a black and white portrait of a man in his late 60s. He stood in front of what must have been the farmhouse, though it looked healthier in the photo, less skeletal. The man was thin, with a wild mane of white hair and a thick beard that hid most of his face. He wore simple, practical clothes, a flannel shirt, and denim overalls. His posture was stiff, his expression stern, almost severe. It was the face of a man who did not suffer fools gladly. Alex could see why his family had called him intimidating. But then Alex looked closer into the man's eyes. Behind the stern facade, there was something else, a depth, a quiet intelligence. And if he looked long enough, a flicker of something that resembled not anger, but a profound and weary kindness. It was the look of a man who had seen too much of the world and decided he preferred his own. This was Grandpa Thomas. The photograph became an obsession. Alex carried it with him for the next 2 days, pulling it out and studying it during his breaks at the diner and in the lonely quiet of the warehouse. The decision he had to make felt monumental. Should he trade the grim certainty of his life in the city for the complete and terrifying uncertainty of a life he couldn't begin to imagine? He made the mistake of calling his mother. "Alex, honey, are you serious?" she'd said, her voice tight with worry over the long-distance line. "You can't take Lily there. That place, it's not a home. It's a ruin. Your grandfather." He wasn't well, Alex. He pushed everyone away. He let that farm fall to pieces around him. Sell it. Take whatever money you can get and use it to find a better apartment here. Please, don't make a terrible mistake. Her words were a bucket of cold water, dousing the tiny flame of hope that had ignited in his chest. She was right. It was reckless. It was irresponsible. He was a father. He couldn't gamble with his daughter's stability, what little of it she had. That evening, he sat on the edge of Lily's bed, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had all but decided to follow his mother's advice. He would call a rural real estate agent, sell the junk farm for scraps, and maybe, just maybe, get enough to pay off his debts and breathe for a month. Lily, however, noticed the photograph clutched in his hand. "Who's that, Daddy?" she asked, her small voice pulling him from his thoughts. That's my grandpa. Your great-grandpa," Alex said softly. Lily took the photo from him, her small fingers surprisingly gentle. She didn't see a stern, reclusive stranger. She saw family. "He looks like a wizard," she whispered in awe, tracing the man's white beard with her fingertip. "The house in the picture. Is that his house?" "It is," Alex confirmed, his throat tight. "It's our house now." Lily's eyes widened, shining with a light that Alex hadn't seen in months. It was pure, undiluted excitement. "Is it a real farm? Does it have animals? Can we get a dog? A big one? And maybe a chicken?" The questions tumbled out of her, a cascade of innocent, hopeful dreams. In her mind, the farm wasn't a problem to be solved. It was an adventure waiting to happen. She wasn't seeing the peeling paint or the potential for leaky roofs. She saw a yard to run in, a dog to play with, and a life bigger than the four walls of their cramped apartment. Looking at her beaming face, Alex felt a profound shift inside him. His mother's sensible warnings, his own paralyzing fears, they all faded into the background. For months, he had been trying to build a shield to protect Lily from the harsh realities of their life. But what if what she needed wasn't a shield, but a horizon? What if the biggest risk wasn't going but staying? "Yeah, sweetie," he heard himself say, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "We can get a dog." The decision was made. 2 weeks later, everything they owned was packed into the back of Alex's aging, rust-pocked pickup truck. He had quit both jobs, paid his landlord what he owed, and said his goodbyes. It was a clean break, a terrifying leap into the void. The drive out of the city was a slow-motion escape. The familiar, oppressive gray of the skyline, the concrete canyons that blocked out the sun, the constant blare of horns and sirens, it all began to recede in his rearview mirror. As they drove further, the landscape transformed. The dense urban sprawl gave way to suburbs, which in turn melted into rolling green hills and wide-open skies. Lily was mesmerized, her face pressed against the passenger window. "Look, Daddy, a cow. Look, a real horse." Each new sight was a marvel. The air itself seemed to change. Alex rolled down his window, and instead of the smell of exhaust and hot pavement, he breathed in the rich, clean scent of damp earth and freshly cut grass. A sense of peace, fragile but real, began to settle in his chest. The constant knot of anxiety in his stomach loosened its grip, just a little. The old truck rattled and groaned, a faithful companion on its last great adventure, carrying them away from their old life and toward something new. After 2 hours, he followed the GPS directions off the main highway and onto a smaller county road. Then, a final turn onto a narrow, unpaved lane marked by a faded wooden sign, Willow Creek, RD. The truck bounced and jostled over the gravel and dirt, kicking up a cloud of dust behind them. The trees on either side grew thicker, their branches interlocking overhead to form a green tunnel. It felt like they were entering another world. And then the tunnel opened up, and they saw it. It stood on a slight rise, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. And it was so much worse than he had ever imagined. The word farmhouse was a kindness it didn't deserve. It was a skeleton, a monument to decay. The roof sagged in the middle, as if exhausted by the effort of holding itself up. The front porch tilted at a drunken angle, its floorboards warped and splintered. Most of the windows were broken, dark, gaping holes that stared out at them like vacant, weeping eyes. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving the wood siding a ghostly, weathered gray. The entire property was being strangled by a jungle of weeds, some as tall as Alex himself. Alex slowly brought the truck to a stop in what might have once been a driveway. He stared, his newfound peace evaporating into a cold dread. His mother's voice echoed in his ears. A terrible mistake. Lily, beside him, was silent for a long moment. "Wow," she finally breathed, her voice small. "It's big." Alex could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. This wasn't an escape. It was a different kind of prison, one made of rot and neglect. He had gambled everything on a faded photograph and a child's dream, and he had lost. As if to punctuate the thought, the truck's engine, which had been rattling valiantly for hours, gave a final, wheezing cough. It sputtered, choked, and then died. Silence descended, broken only by the chirping of crickets in the overgrown grass. He turned the key. Nothing. He tried again. Only a sickening, empty click answered. They were here, and they were stranded. For a long moment, Alex didn't move. He sat gripping the steering wheel, the dead silence of the engine, a final, damning verdict on his decision. Stranded. In front of a house that looked like it was one stiff breeze away from collapsing into a pile of kindling. The hopeful energy of the journey had completely drained away, replaced by the cold, heavy reality of his failure. "Is the truck sleeping, Daddy?" Lily asked, her innocent question slicing through his paralysis. Alex forced a smile that felt brittle, like it might crack his face. "Yeah, sweetie, it's just tired from the long trip. Let's go check out our new home." He slid out of the driver's seat, his boots landing in a patch of thorny weeds. The air, which had smelled so clean and fresh on the main road, here felt thick and stagnant. It carried the scent of decay, of damp, rotting wood and generations of dust. He helped Lily out, and together they stood before the house, a modern-day Hansel and Gretel staring at a witch's cottage that had long since been abandoned. He pushed against the front gate. It screeched in protest, its rusty hinges groaning, before grudgingly swinging open. They walked up the overgrown path, the porch steps creaking ominously under Alex's weight. He found the key the lawyer had sent him, a heavy, old-fashioned iron key, and slid it into the lock on the front door. It turned with a grating sound, and the door swung inward into darkness. The smell hit them first. It was an oppressive mix of dust, mildew, and the faint, musty scent of a place that had been sealed shut for years. Alex fumbled for a light switch, but of course, there was no power. Sunlight struggled to pierce the grimy windows, illuminating a scene of chaotic neglect. The living room was cluttered with furniture draped in white sheets, making the chairs and sofa look like a congregation of silent, bulky ghosts. Dust motes danced in the pale shafts of light. In the kitchen, a layer of grime coated every surface, and a single, cracked plate sat on the counter, a lonely relic of his grandfather's last meal. Every room told the same story, a life lived in solitude and a slow, steady surrender to entropy. Alex felt his heart sink with every step. This wasn't a fixer-upper. This was an archaeological dig. Lily, however, seemed undaunted. While Alex saw only problems, she saw possibilities. She ran her small hand over a dusty banister and peered into cobweb-filled corners with a sense of adventure. In what must have been a small study, she found something. "Daddy, look!" Tucked away on a cluttered bookshelf was a small, wooden music box, its varnish cracked and faded. Lily picked it up and carefully turned the small crank on the bottom. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a series of faint, tinkling notes filled the dusty air, a fragile, beautiful melody that felt impossibly out of place in the surrounding decay. It was a single, tiny spark of beauty in a sea of ruin, and seeing the wonder on Lily's face gave Alex a much-needed sliver of strength. He took a deep breath. "All right," he said, more to himself than to her. "Let's start by getting our things inside." As he stepped back out onto the porch, a voice startled him. "Well now, look what the cat dragged in." Alex turned. Leaning against a pristine white picket fence that marked the edge of the neighboring property was a man. He was in his late 60s, with a round belly that strained against his polo shirt and a face that seemed permanently set in an expression of smug disapproval. He held a pair of pruning shears, which he used to idly snip at a perfectly manicured rosebush. "Heard old Tom finally passed," the man continued, his voice carrying a distinct, nasally drawl. He didn't walk over. He just watched them from a distance, like a zookeeper observing a new and slightly disappointing exhibit. That man was always a bit off. "You must be the grandson." "Alex Evans," Alex said, extending a hand out of habit before realizing the man had no intention of crossing the property line. He let his arm drop awkwardly. The man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Henderson. Been living next to this eyesore for 30 years. He gestured dismissively at the house with his shears. "Should have let the bank take this dump. It's a teardown, son. A money pit. You'd be better off bulldozing it and selling the land." The words were blunt, unvarnished, and they landed like a punch to the gut. This man, Mr. Henderson, was the physical embodiment of all of Alex's worst fears. "We're going to fix it up," Alex said, a defiant edge to his voice that he didn't feel. Henderson raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Right. Well, good luck with that," he said, the words dripping with condescension. He turned back to his roses, his posture making it clear that the conversation was over. He had passed his judgment, and it was final. The encounter left a bitter taste in Alex's mouth. It fueled him with a strange, stubborn cocktail of anger and determination. He would prove this man wrong. He had to. The next few days were a blur of grueling, back-breaking labor. With the truck dead, they were isolated. The first priority was making one room habitable. He chose a small bedroom on the ground floor, one with the least amount of water damage. He tore out the molding carpet, scrubbed the floors until his knuckles were raw, and painstakingly washed the window until sunlight could finally stream in, bright and unfiltered. They slept on an air mattress, their belongings piled in a corner, but it was their space. It was a start. From his own yard, Mr. Henderson watched. Alex would be on the roof, attempting to patch a leak with tar and salvaged shingles, his face and arms smeared with black, and he'd look over to see Henderson shaking his head with a smirk before turning on his sprinklers to water his immaculate lawn. When Alex spent an entire afternoon wrestling a stubborn, overgrown bush out of the ground, Henderson called over, "You know, a professional would have that done in 20 minutes. The man's constant silent mockery was a slow drip torture. It wormed its way into Alex's thoughts, amplifying his own doubts. Every setback, a rusted pipe that burst, a floorboard that gave way, the discovery of a wasp nest in the eaves felt like a confirmation of Henderson's verdict. But then there was Lily. She was his shadow, his tiny cheerleader. While he saw grime, she saw a canvas. She found an old watering can and spent hours tending to a single, resilient dandelion that had pushed its way through a crack in the walkway, treating it with the same care Henderson gave his prize-winning roses. She collected smooth, interesting-looking stones and arranged them on the porch steps. She made the ruin her kingdom. One afternoon, after a particularly brutal struggle to fix the front door so it would actually lock, Alex slumped onto the porch steps, utterly defeated. He was covered in sweat and grime, a new splinter in his palm, and the door was still stubbornly askew. He felt the familiar despair creeping in. He had been a fool. Henderson was right. Just then, Lily came and sat beside him. She didn't say anything. She just handed him a small, slightly wilted wildflower she had picked from the edge of the woods. "It's for the table," she said simply. "To make it pretty." Alex looked from the tiny flower in his hand to his daughter's earnest face. In that moment, he saw the farm through her eyes again. Not as a collection of problems, but as a home waiting to be woken up. Henderson, with his perfect lawn and his perfect roses, would never understand that. His world was built on tearing things down: opinions, hopes, old houses. Alex had to be a builder. He closed his hand around the small flower. "You're right, sweetie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's beautiful." That evening, they cleared a small patch of the yard near the porch. It was hard work, digging up tangled roots and pulling weeds that seemed to have been growing since the dawn of time. But by sunset, they had a small square of dark, rich earth. They took the packet of vegetable seeds they had bought with the last of their cash before leaving the city and pushed them into the soil one by one. They watered the small patch with Lily's watering can. It was a tiny act of defiance against the overwhelming neglect. It was a symbol. They weren't just clearing away the old, they were planting something new. They were putting down roots, however small and fragile, in the stubborn, unwelcoming ground. Across the way, the porch light on the Henderson house flicked on, casting a sterile yellow glow. Alex paid it no mind. He stayed there, on his knees in the dirt beside his daughter, until the last of the sunlight faded from the sky. The work was far from over, but for the first time since they'd arrived, it didn't feel impossible. It felt like a beginning. Weeks bled into one another, each day a mirror of the last. The rhythm of Alex's life was now dictated by the sun and the seemingly infinite list of tasks the house demanded. He woke with the dawn, his body a symphony of aches, and worked until twilight painted the sky in shades of orange and purple. His hands, once soft from city life, were now rough and calloused, etched with a roadmap of splinters, cuts, and blisters. He was making progress, but it was agonizingly slow. It was a battle of attrition. For every leaky pipe he fixed, a floorboard would creak with a new and alarming finality. For every window pane he replaced, he'd discover a new draft whistling through a crack in the wall. The house felt less like an inanimate object and more like a stubborn, wounded beast, resisting his every attempt to heal it. His hope, once a burning flame of defiance, was now a flickering ember, constantly threatened by the winds of exhaustion and doubt. Their small garden was growing. The first green shoots a daily reminder of life's persistence, but their funds were dwindling to almost nothing. He'd managed to get the truck running after 2 days of tinkering, but he used it sparingly, hoarding their meager supply of cash for food and essential supplies. The isolation was beginning to press in on him. One particularly sweltering afternoon, he decided to tackle the final frontier of the house, the attic. He'd been putting it off, dreading what he might find up there. It was the house's subconscious, a dark, dusty space where decades of forgotten things were left to rot. But he needed the space, and more importantly, he needed to know the full extent of what he was dealing with. He pulled down the rickety folding ladder from the hallway ceiling. It groaned under his weight as he ascended into the oppressive heat of the upper floor. The air in the attic was thick and suffocating, tasting of dry wood, dead insects, and the ghostly scent of time itself. Shafts of sunlight pierced through gaps in the roof, illuminating a world layered in gray. Everything was shrouded in a thick veil of cobwebs that stretched from the rafters to the floor like ghostly drapery. It was a graveyard of forgotten objects. A rusty birdcage, a dressmaker's mannequin with a hole in its chest, stacks of yellowed newspapers with headlines announcing wars and elections long past, and boxes. So many boxes, all sealed with brittle yellowed tape. It felt like a desecration to disturb this silent, dusty tomb, but he had no choice. He started in one corner, methodically moving things, sorting junk from potential keepsakes, though most of it seemed to be the former. He worked for hours, sweat stinging his eyes, his t-shirt soaked through. The heat was relentless. He came to a large, heavy trunk in the far corner, tucked away under the eaves. It was an old, sea-worn chest, bound with rusted iron straps. It was too heavy to lift, so he tried to drag it. As he pulled, there was a sickening crunching sound. He stopped, thinking he'd broken the trunk, but the sound had come from beneath him. He looked down. His left foot had gone partially through a floorboard. He swore under his breath, expecting to see rotten, termite-eaten wood. He knelt to inspect the damage, annoyance prickling him. But as he pulled at the splintered edges, he realized this was different. The break was too clean. The edges of the surrounding boards were solid. This particular plank hadn't rotted through. It looked like it had been deliberately cut and placed back, a carefully concealed seam running along its length. His curiosity piqued. He found a small crowbar amongst a pile of old tools and carefully wedged it into the seam. With a gentle push, the board lifted up, not with a crack, but with a soft sigh of released pressure. The space beneath wasn't part of the ceiling below. It was a hidden compartment, a shallow cavity nestled between the rafters. And nestled inside was a small, hand-carved wooden box. Alex's heart began to beat a little faster. This was it, the classic storybook moment, the hidden treasure. Visions of gold coins, of antique jewelry, of a stack of cash that would solve all his problems, danced in his head. The box was beautiful, carved from a dark, rich wood with intricate patterns of leaves and vines. In the center of the lid was a small brass lock, green with age. He lifted it out. It was lighter than he expected, too light to be filled with gold. His initial surge of excitement was tempered with caution. Taped to the top of the box was an envelope, the paper so old and yellow it was almost translucent. His grandfather's elegant, looping handwriting was on the front, addressed simply to "My grandson." With a trembling hand, Alex slid his finger under the flap and pulled out the single, folded piece of paper inside. He unfolded it. The ink was faded but still legible. It was a short, cryptic message. The greatest treasures are not of gold, but of the heart and mind. The key is not for the box, but for the whispers. He read the note again, and a third time. The key is not for the box, but for the whispers. What on earth did that mean? He looked at the box again. If the key wasn't for the box, how was he supposed to open it? And what whispers? The only sound in the attic was the frantic thumping of his own heart and the buzzing of a fly trapped against a dusty window pane. Frustration washed over him, hot and sharp. It felt like a cruel joke, a final, maddening riddle from the eccentric old man he'd never known. Here he was, on the verge of destitution, and his grandfather had left him a locked box and a nonsensical poem. He shook the box. It made a soft, muffled rattling sound, but gave no clue as to its contents. He searched the compartment again, hoping for a key, another clue, anything. But there was nothing, just the dark, empty space. He looked around the attic, his eyes scanning the dusty chaos. Whispers, he muttered aloud, the words sounding absurd in the heavy silence. Was it a code? A location? He looked for anything that might suggest a whisper. A hidden speaking tube? An old phonograph? Nothing. The heat, the dust, the exhaustion, and now this frustrating puzzle, it was all too much. He felt a surge of anger. He was tempted to take the crowbar and smash the box open, to shatter the infuriating little riddle and be done with it. He was a desperate man, and he had no time for games. But something stopped him. It was the note. The greatest treasures are not of gold. The elegance of the handwriting, the careful choice of words, it didn't feel like the work of a man playing a cruel trick. It felt like an invitation. He picked up the locked box and the note and made his way back down the rickety ladder, leaving the rest of the attic's secrets for another day. He stepped out of the suffocating heat and into the relative cool of the hallway, blinking as his eyes adjusted to the light. He sat down on the floor, leaning against the wall, the wooden box in his lap. He looked at the note again, turning the words over and over in his mind. Whispers. The word echoed, refusing to yield its meaning. It felt like the entire house was holding its breath, guarding a secret that was just beyond his grasp. He had found a clue, a tangible piece of the puzzle of his grandfather's life. But instead of providing answers, it had only deepened the mystery, leaving him more lost than ever before. The riddle consumed him. For the next 2 days, the small locked box sat on the kitchen counter, a constant, silent provocation. Alex's mind became a frantic maze of possibilities. Whispers became the central obsession of his waking hours. He walked through the house, running his hands along the walls, tapping on floorboards, searching for anything that could be a clue. He checked for loose bricks in the fireplace and hollow spaces behind bookshelves. He even tried whispering into old pipes, listening for an echo, an answer, anything. The house remained stubbornly silent. He had found a small, ornate brass key tucked away in a dusty jar of old buttons, but his hopes were quickly dashed. He tried it on the box's lock. It didn't fit. The key was too large, its shape all wrong. The frustration was immense. He felt like a fool, chasing a ghost through a house of secrets, while the real-world problems of dwindling food and money piled up. Mr. Henderson's mocking face swam in his mind's eye, and he felt a fresh wave of shame. Perhaps he really was just a fool who had inherited a pile of junk and a nonsensical puzzle. He was on the verge of giving up, of taking a hammer to the box and ending the maddening game. He was cleaning out the small, cluttered room that he assumed had been his grandfather's study, a space he'd largely ignored until now. He was piling old, mildewed books into a cardboard box for disposal when Lily ran into the room, her face alight with excitement. "Daddy, come see! I made a fort!" She grabbed his hand and pulled him towards her creation. She had taken one of the old sheets they'd used to cover the furniture and draped it over 2 dusty armchairs, creating a small, cozy tent in the middle of the room. Alex smiled, the first genuine smile he'd felt in days. "It's a great fort, sweetie," he said, crawling halfway inside with her. Inside her makeshift castle, Lily was playing with a few of her treasures, the smooth stones from the garden, the dandelions she had pressed between the pages of a book, and the old music box from the shelf. As she played, she ran her hand along the leg of one of the armchairs. Then, she did the same to the leg of a large, dark wood writing desk that formed one of the walls of her fort. "This one's bumpy, Daddy," she said, her small fingers tracing a pattern he couldn't see from his angle. "Look at the pretty bird on the table's leg." Alex's mind was still on the riddle, and he almost dismissed her comment, but something in her words snagged his attention. A bird? He crawled out of the fort and knelt beside the desk. It was an old, handsome piece of furniture made of a dark, heavy oak. Unlike almost everything else in the house, it was strangely well maintained. While the surfaces were dusty, the wood beneath was polished and cared for, as if it had been a cherished possession. And there, on the front-facing leg, just as Lily had said, was a carving. It wasn't a bird. It was a single, exquisitely detailed feather, its delicate barbs etched into the wood with the skill of a master craftsman. It was so subtle he had never noticed it before. His breath caught. He remembered the brass key from the button jar, the one that didn't fit the box. He pulled it from his pocket. On the end of the key, as a decorative handle, was a small, cast metal bird. A feather. A bird. It couldn't be a coincidence. He examined the carved feather on the desk leg, his heart beginning to pound a heavy, hopeful rhythm against his ribs. He ran his fingers over the intricate carving, feeling for a notch, a button, a hidden release. He found nothing. But then, his finger traced the line of the feather's hollow shaft, the quill, and there, almost invisible against the dark grain of the wood, was a tiny, dark circle, a keyhole. It was no bigger than a pinprick, perfectly hidden within the design. His hand shook as he lifted the key. He oriented it carefully, the bird on the key aligning with the carved feather. With a sense of surreal certainty, he pushed the key into the tiny hole. It slid in perfectly. He turned it. A soft click echoed in the silent room. It was a quiet sound, but it felt as loud as a gunshot. For a moment, nothing happened. Alex's hope faltered. But then, a section of the flat surface of the desk, a piece he had assumed was solid wood, popped up with a gentle, spring-loaded sigh. It was a hidden compartment. Alex stared, his mouth agape. He had been so focused on the box, so certain the treasure was inside it, that he had missed the real secret entirely. The note was literal. The key wasn't for the box. It was for the desk. The desk held the whispers. Slowly, reverently, he reached into the compartment. There was no gold, no stacks of cash. It was something far more unexpected. The compartment was filled to the brim with stacks of paper, bound in dark, supple leather and tied neatly with twine. They were manuscripts, dozens of them. He lifted out the first, topmost stack. The leather cover was soft and worn, like a beloved book. On the front, embossed in elegant, curling script, was a title: The Whispering Chronicles, Book 1 of the Athelgard Saga. He untied the twine and opened the cover. The pages were filled with his grandfather's handwriting, not the messy scrawl of a man in a hurry, but a beautiful, patient calligraphy. The margins were filled with breathtakingly detailed pencil sketches, maps of imaginary lands, fantastical creatures with intelligent eyes, and architectural drawings of castles that seemed to defy gravity. He flipped through the pages, his awe growing with each one. This wasn't a hobby. This was a life's work. A complete multi-book fantasy series, written and illustrated with a level of detail and passion that was staggering. He saw titles for other books in the saga: The Serpent's Shadow, The Last Starstone, The King of the Whispering Wood. The whispers weren't a sound. They were the stories. He suddenly understood his grandfather in a way the faded photograph never could have conveyed. The reclusive, eccentric old man hadn't been pushing the world away out of bitterness or madness. He had been building a new one, a world of his own creation, vast and beautiful and secret. This desk wasn't just furniture, it was a portal. The farmhouse wasn't a prison. It was a monastery, a quiet sanctuary where this incredible, hidden universe had been born. He looked over at Lily, who was still playing happily in her fort, oblivious to the monumental discovery he had just made. He thought about the bedtime stories he used to read her back in the city, cheap paperbacks with simple plots and cartoonish drawings. And then he looked at the manuscript in his hands. He finally turned his attention back to the locked wooden box, which he had all but forgotten. He now knew it didn't hold a monetary treasure. It held something else. With a new understanding, he examined it again. There was no hinge. Instead, he found a complex series of sliding panels, a wooden puzzle box. Following the patterns of the carved leaves and vines, he pushed and slid the panels in a specific sequence. After a final, satisfying click, the lid lifted off. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single object, a beautifully crafted fountain pen, its nib worn from what must have been millions of words. Beside it was a small, leather-bound journal. He opened it. The first page contained a single sentence, written in the same elegant hand. For my grandson. May you find your own worlds to build. Thomas Evans. A wave of emotion washed over Alex, so powerful it made him dizzy. It was a connection across time, a legacy passed down not through blood or property, but through the shared, sacred act of creation. He hadn't just found a collection of stories, he had found his grandfather. That night, the small, clean bedroom was transformed. The single lamp cast a warm, golden glow, pushing back the shadows of the old house. Lily was tucked into her bed on the air mattress, her eyes wide with anticipation. For the first time since they had arrived, Alex wasn't going to read her a worn-out paperback from their small collection. He held the first of his grandfather's leather-bound manuscripts in his hands. It felt both ancient and brand new, a sacred text waiting for its first sermon. "This is a special story, sweetie," he said, his voice softer than usual. "It's a secret story that Grandpa Thomas wrote just for us." He opened to the first page and began to read. "The Whispering Wood does not appear on any map made by men," he started, his voice gaining confidence with each word. "It does not grow on common soil, but rather at the edge of the world, where the dreams of sleeping children take root and sprout into silver-leaf trees." As he read, something magical happened. The room, with its bare walls and simple furnishings, seemed to melt away. The world of their hardship, the leaky roof, The dwindling funds, Mr. Henderson's sneering face vanished. It was replaced by the world his grandfather had built. They journeyed alongside the story's hero, a clever young fox named Finian, who wore a tiny leather satchel and was on a quest to find the lost singing stone. Alex's voice gave life to a host of characters. A grumpy but wise old badger who was a master of ancient maps, a flighty hummingbird who spoke only in riddles, and a shadowy villain known as the Gnarled One, who sought to silence the wood forever. Lily was utterly entranced. She didn't fidget or interrupt. She lay perfectly still, her eyes fixed on her father's face, her imagination painting the scenes he described. When he read about the glowing moss that lit the forest floor, she gasped. When Finian the fox narrowly escaped a trap set by the Gnarled One's thorny minions, she burrowed deeper under her blanket, her knuckles white. Alex, too, was lost in the tale. The quality of the writing was astonishing. It wasn't just a children's story, it was a rich, layered mythology. The prose was beautiful and evocative. The characters were complex and endearing, and the plot was woven with suspense and genuine heart. He realized his grandfather wasn't just a storyteller, he was a master craftsman, a literary architect of the highest order. The man who had seemed so stern and distant in the photograph was, on the page, full of wit, warmth, and a profound understanding of courage and friendship. When he finished the third chapter and finally looked up, Lily's eyes were heavy with sleep, but bright with a lingering wonder. "Is Finian going to be okay, Daddy?" she whispered. "We'll find out tomorrow night," Alex promised, gently closing the manuscript. "Promise?" "I promise." As she drifted off to sleep, a peaceful smile on her face, Alex felt a fundamental shift in his own purpose. The farm was no longer just a shelter to be repaired. The manuscripts weren't just a curiosity, this was a legacy. His motivation was no longer simply about survival, it was about stewardship. He had a duty to his grandfather, whom he felt he was finally getting to know, and to his daughter, whose life had just been illuminated by this newfound magic. He had to share this world with others. The next day, a new energy coursed through him. The physical labor on the house no longer felt like a punishment. It felt like he was restoring a monument, the very workshop where this magic had been created. While he worked, his mind was in the whispering wood, turning over plot points and character arcs. That evening, after putting Lily to bed with 3 more chapters of Finian's adventure, Alex stayed up late. He cleared the surface of the great oak writing desk, wiping away the last of the dust, and set the first manuscript beside it. In one of the desk's drawers, he'd found a treasure trove, an old, heavy-duty manual typewriter, miraculously protected from the elements in a sturdy case, along with stacks of thick, creamy paper and spare ink ribbons. He threaded a sheet of paper into the machine. The first keystroke was deafening in the quiet house, a sharp, mechanical clack that sounded like a declaration. He began the painstaking process of transcribing his grandfather's elegant handwriting into clean, uniform type. The Whispering Chronicles, Book 1 of the Aethelgard Saga, by Thomas Evans, Chapter 1. The clacking of the keys became the new heartbeat of the house. It was a slow, methodical process. He was a clumsy typist, and his fingers, calloused from physical labor, often hit the wrong keys. He would have to stop, use correction fluid, and start again. But he didn't mind. Each perfectly typed page felt like a victory, a small act of restoration. He was a bridge between his grandfather's silent genius and the world that had never known it existed. For over a week, this became his new routine. Days were for the house patching, painting, planting. Nights were for the manuscript reading to Lily, then typing late into the silent hours, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a growing sense of mission. As he typed, he became the story's first editor. He didn't change the plot or the prose, but he standardized the formatting, corrected the occasional spelling error he found, and made notes in the margins about the brilliant illustrations. The world of Aethelgard became as real to him as the scent of pine from the woods outside or the taste of the fresh tomatoes ripening in their small garden. One evening, as he was typing, he came across a passage that made him stop. Finian, the fox, lost and alone, had stumbled into a dark, frightening part of the wood. The text described his fear, his isolation, his feeling of being utterly overwhelmed. It was a perfect mirror of how Alex had felt just weeks ago, sitting in his cramped apartment, staring at a mountain of bills. He read the lines that followed, but even in the deepest dark, his grandfather had written, Finian remembered the warmth of the sun on his fur, and he knew that as long as he kept putting one paw in front of the other, he would eventually walk back into the light. Alex leaned back in his chair, a lump forming in his throat. It was as if his grandfather was speaking directly to him across the decades. He felt a profound, unspoken understanding. This story wasn't just fantasy. It was a vessel for real, human truth. Finally, after nearly 2 weeks of nightly work, the last page was typed. He held the finished manuscript in his hands, a thick, satisfying stack of paper. It was tangible. It was real. A wild, terrifying idea, which had been a faint whisper in the back of his mind, now became a roar. He had to try. It was the longest of long shots, a desperate, hopeful prayer sent out into the universe. But he owed it to Finian, he owed it to Lily, and he owed it to the strange, brilliant man whose blood ran in his veins. The next morning, he drove the sputtering pickup truck into the nearest small town and found the local library. He used one of their public computers, his fingers fumbling on the modern keyboard, and searched for literary agencies. The names that came up were intimidating. Huge, powerful firms in New York City that represented world-famous authors. It felt impossibly arrogant to think they would even look at a submission from an unknown man in a forgotten farmhouse. He almost closed the browser, but a vision of Lily's rapt face as she listened to the story stopped him. He took a deep breath and chose one of the most prestigious firms on the list, the Sterling Agency. Their website had a submissions page with clear instructions. He followed them to the letter. He wrote a short, simple, and honest cover letter. He didn't embellish. He just explained that he had discovered the unpublished work of his late grandfather and believed it was something special. Then came the final, heart-stopping step. He attached the digital file of the manuscript he had scanned at the library. His finger hovered over the send button for a full minute. This was it, the culmination of everything. He squeezed his eyes shut and clicked. An automated message popped up instantly. Thank you for your submission. Due to the high volume of queries we receive, we will only respond if we are interested. He logged off, his heart pounding. The feeling was one of equal parts, terror and exhilaration. He had taken his shot. He had honored the whispers. Now, all he could do was go back to the farm and wait. The act of hitting send had been a surge of adrenaline, a momentary, thrilling leap from a high dive. The days that followed were the long, silent fall back to earth. Life at the farm returned to its familiar rhythm, but now it was underpinned by a new and constant tension. Every time Alex worked on the house, a part of his mind was elsewhere, in a sleek New York office, imagining a literary agent opening his email. He tried to push it from his thoughts, to manage his expectations. The agency's automated reply had been clear: we will only respond if we are interested. He knew what that meant. In all likelihood, he would never hear anything again. Still, hope is a stubborn weed. Each afternoon, when the rural mail carrier's small truck rattled past their lane, Alex would feel a nervous flutter in his stomach. He'd check his phone constantly for new emails, his heart skipping a beat at every notification, only to be disappointed by spam or a low battery warning. A week passed. The silence from New York was deafening. He finished reading the Whispering Chronicles to Lily, and they immediately started it over from the beginning, the story now a beloved ritual. The world of Ethelgard was their sanctuary, but the real world, with its practical demands, was beginning to encroach again. Their small vegetable garden was producing a meager but welcome bounty of tomatoes and zucchini, but it wasn't enough. Their cash reserves had dwindled to almost nothing. 2 weeks passed. The silence began to feel less like anticipation and more like a verdict. Alex's hope, once so bright, started to curdle into a bitter mixture of embarrassment and regret. He felt like an idiot. Who was he to think he could just send a manuscript to a top-tier agency and expect a response? He was a line cook and a warehouse stocker, not some literary savant. He had let a child's story, however beautiful, blind him to reality. The third week was when things began to unravel. It started with a storm. A vicious thunderstorm rolled in one evening, unleashing a torrent of rain that hammered against the old house. Alex and Lily sat inside, listening to the wind howl and the rain beat against the windows. They were in the one room he'd managed to fully repair, a small, cozy den. But then came a sound that made Alex's blood run cold. A steady, rhythmic drip, 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 coming from the living room. He rushed in to find a dark, spreading stain on the ceiling. A stream of water was trickling down the wall, pooling on the floorboards he had spent a week sanding and sealing. The patch he'd put on the roof hadn't held. All that work, all that effort, washed away in a single night. A profound sense of futility washed over him. It felt like the house itself was rejecting him, refusing to be saved. The next morning, the true disaster struck. He needed to go into town for supplies, a new bucket of tar for the roof, and more importantly, food. He loaded Lily into the passenger seat of the old pickup. He turned the key. The engine gave a weak, sputtering cough, a sound he knew all too well. He tried again. Nothing but a pathetic, metallic click. He got out and popped the hood, though he knew it was hopeless. He wasn't a mechanic. He stared at the greasy, complicated tangle of wires and belts, feeling utterly useless. The truck, their only link to the outside world, was dead for good this time. They were stranded. "We'll have to walk, sweetie," he said, trying to keep the rising panic out of his voice. "It'll be an adventure." The walk to town was over 4 miles along the shoulder of the county road. The sun beat down on them, and by the time they reached the small general store, they were both exhausted and drenched in sweat. He bought the tar and what little food he could afford, the coins he counted out onto the counter, a stark reminder of their precarious situation. The walk back was even worse, burdened by the heavy supplies. Halfway home, a familiar car slowed down beside them. It was Mr. Henderson, his air-conditioned sedan gliding to a smooth stop. He rolled down the passenger window. "Having some car trouble, Evans?" he asked, though it wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, layered with a thick coating of pity, and I told you so. "Something like that," Alex mumbled, not breaking his stride. Henderson shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion of condescending sympathy. "Told you that place was a curse, son. Sucks you dry. You and the little one ought to have stayed in the city where you belong." He didn't offer a ride. He just looked at Alex's sweat-soaked shirt and the heavy bucket in his hand, gave a final, pitying sigh, and drove off, leaving them in a cloud of dust. That was the breaking point. The casual cruelty of the comment, the physical exhaustion, the relentless setbacks, it all coalesced into a single crushing weight. When they finally got back to the farm, Alex set the supplies down on the porch and slumped onto the steps, burying his face in his hands. This was it, rock bottom. He had dragged his daughter out to the middle of nowhere, stranded her in a decaying house with no money and no transportation, all based on a fantasy. He was a fool, an irresponsible, naive fool. The stories weren't a legacy. They were a delusion he had used to justify a reckless gamble that had failed spectacularly. His mother had been right. Henderson had been right. Everyone had been right but him. A wave of cold, desolate shame washed over him. He had failed Lily in every conceivable way. He had promised her a better life, a dog, a garden, and he had given her isolation, poverty, and a house that was falling down around them. Tears of frustration and despair welled in his eyes. He felt a small hand on his shoulder. He looked up. Lily was standing beside him, her face etched with a concern that was far too old for her 7 years. She didn't say anything about the truck, or the long walk, or the leaky roof. She just looked at him, her expression one of pure, unwavering love. "It's okay, Daddy," she said softly, her voice a balm on his frayed nerves. She leaned against him, her small head resting on his arm. "You can read me more about the Whispering Fox tonight." Her words hit him with the force of a physical blow. In the midst of his complete and utter despair, she wasn't thinking about their problems. She was thinking about the story. To her, the magic was still real. The world of Ethelgard, of Finian the brave fox, was more real and more important than a broken-down truck or a smug neighbor. It was their rock, their constant. Her simple, unshakable faith in the story and his grandfather's legacy was the only thing holding him together in that moment. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. Her faith was a lifeline. It wouldn't fix the roof or the truck, but it was enough to pull him back from the edge of the abyss. He had made a promise to her and to the memory of his grandfather. He couldn't give up, not yet. He didn't know how they would get through the next day or the day after that, but he knew that tonight he would keep his promise. He would open the leather-bound manuscript, and for a few precious hours, they would escape into a world where courage always triumphed and the light was always waiting, just beyond the darkness. It was all he had left to give. The next day dawned gray and oppressive. the weather a perfect reflection of Alex's mood. The brief reprieve of the previous night's storytelling had faded with the morning light, leaving behind the cold, hard facts of their situation. He spent the morning on the roof, methodically applying the new tar, his movements slow and heavy. Every scrape of the trowel felt like a penance for his foolishness. The hope he'd harbored about the manuscript was gone, replaced by a grim, joyless determination to simply survive. He had decided that tomorrow he would begin the long walk back into town to find a phone and call a real estate agent. He would sell the land for whatever he could get. It was a bitter pill to swallow, an admission of complete defeat, but he could no longer subject Lily to this life. They would take the money, however little, and crawl back to the city with their tails between their legs. The thought made his stomach churn. He was in the garden with Lily in the late afternoon, picking the last of their ripe tomatoes when it happened. His cell phone, which had been little more than a pocket-sized clock for the past week, suddenly rang. The sound was so unexpected, so alien in the quiet country air, that he flinched. He fumbled in his pocket and pulled it out. The screen was cracked, the battery icon flashing a desperate red, but it was lit up with an incoming call, an unknown number. Area code 212, New York City. His heart stopped. Then it started again, a frantic, hammering rhythm against his ribs. It couldn't be. It was impossible. It had to be a wrong number, a telemarketer, a cruel twist of fate. He stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the green accept icon, a dozen conflicting emotions warring inside him. Fear, disbelief, and a tiny, terrifying spark of hope he thought had been extinguished for good. "Daddy, your phone's ringing," Lily said, stating the obvious. Her voice broke the spell. He took a shaky breath and answered, pressing the phone to his ear with a hand that trembled slightly. "Hello," he said, his voice a hoarse croak. "Hello, am I speaking with Mr. Alexander Evans?" The voice on the other end was female, professional, and crackling with an energy that felt a world away from his dusty garden. "This is he," Alex managed to say. "Mr. Evans, my name is Sarah Sterling. I'm the senior literary agent and founder of the Sterling Agency. I'm calling about the manuscript you sent us, The Whispering Chronicles." Alex's knees felt weak. He had to brace himself against the side of the house. The rough, sun-warmed wood, a grounding sensation in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. Sarah Sterling, the founder, not an assistant, not an intern. The head of the agency, yes, was all he could manage. There was a pause on the other end, and then a sound that sounded suspiciously like an excited laugh. "Mr. Evans, I need you to prepare yourself. I've been an agent for 25 years. I've seen it all. I've discovered best-selling authors. I've negotiated movie deals. I've read tens of thousands of submissions. And I can tell you, with no exaggeration, that I have never, ever seen anything like this." Her voice was a torrent of enthusiasm, each word hitting Alex with the force of a small, pleasant shock. "The world building," she continued, her pace quickening, "the sheer, breathtaking scope of the mythology your grandfather created. It's magical. The characters, Finian, the badger, they feel more real than most people I know. It's not just a children's book, Mr. Evans. It's a classic. It's a universe. It's the kind of story that comes along once in a generation." Alex slid down the wall until he was sitting on the ground, the phone pressed hard against his ear. He couldn't speak. He could only listen, his mind struggling to process the flood of information. "We don't just want to represent it," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a more serious, business-like tone. "We've already taken the liberty of showing the first 5 chapters to a few select editors, under strict non-disclosure agreements, of course. The response has been, well, unprecedented is the only word for it." A bidding war erupted almost immediately. "Mr. Evans, are you sitting down?" "Yes," he whispered. "Good." Penguin Random House, one of the biggest publishers in the world, is prepared to offer a multi-book deal for the entire Ethelgard saga. For the first book alone, they are offering an advance. She paused for dramatic effect. A 7-figure advance. The words hung in the air. 7 figures. The number was so abstract, so impossibly large, that it had no meaning. It was a concept, not a real amount of money. He thought of the overdue bills, the few crumpled dollars in his wallet, the shame of counting out coins at the general store. The contrast was so violent it made him feel lightheaded. I don't understand, he stammered. It means they want to pay you over $1 million, Mr. Evans, Sarah said, her voice gentle now, as if speaking to someone in shock. And that's just the beginning. We've had calls from 3 major film studios already, just based on the synopsis. We're talking merchandise, animated series. This is a global franchise. Your grandfather didn't just write a book. He created an intellectual property that our experts estimate could be worth, well, the numbers are staggering. Alex closed his eyes. The stern, lonely man in the faded photograph, the quiet genius at his dusty desk. He had been building an empire, and no one had ever known. A tear slid from beneath his eyelid and traced a path through the grime on his cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or frustration. It was a tear of profound, overwhelming relief. Mr. Evans, are you still there? Yes, he said, his voice finally returning, thick with emotion. Yes, I'm here. They talked for another 20 minutes. Sarah explained the next steps, contracts, lawyers, financial advisors. It was a dizzying flood of information, but Alex absorbed it all. When he finally hung up, he didn't move. He sat on the ground, the phone still clutched in his hand, and stared out at the overgrown yard and the dilapidated house. It looked different. The peeling paint no longer looked like decay, it looked like character. The sagging porch no longer looked like a failure, it looked like a foundation. This wasn't a ruin. It was the cradle of a multi-million-dollar legacy. Lily, who had been watching him with quiet curiosity, came over and touched his arm. Are you okay, Daddy? You're crying. Alex looked at her, his vision blurred. He scooped her up in a fierce, sudden hug, burying his face in her hair. He held her tight, a grounding force in his spinning world. They're happy tears, sweetie, he said, his voice choked. He pulled back and looked her in the eye, a wide, incredulous grin spreading across his face. Lily. Grandpa Thomas's stories. They're real magic, the most powerful magic in the world. He tried to explain it in a way she could understand. The huge, life-altering concepts boiled down to their simplest truth. A woman in a big city read about Finian the Fox, and she loved him so much. She wants to put the story in a real book, with a hardcover, a book that children all over the world can read. Lily's eyes widened. Really? All over the world? Yes, Alex said, laughing a sound of pure, unadulterated joy. And she said, we don't have to worry anymore about anything. He stood up, pulling Lily into the air and spinning her around. She shrieked with delight, her laughter echoing through the quiet afternoon. For the first time, the sound of their joy felt bigger than the house's silence. He had been so wrong. The farm wasn't a curse. It was a blessing, the greatest treasure hunt of his life. And he had just finally found the X that marked the spot. And the treasure wasn't just money. It was his grandfather's voice, finally being heard. It was his daughter's future, suddenly limitless. It was a second chance he never thought he would get. The weeks following the phone call were a surreal whirlwind. Alex's life, once a slow, grueling battle against decay, was now a dizzying blur of conference calls, emails, and overnighted documents that arrived in crisp, important-looking envelopes. The rustic quiet of the farm was now punctuated by the digital chimes of his new, company-provided smartphone. Sarah Sterling and her team at the agency moved with breathtaking speed. First came the lawyers. Alex spoke with a man named David Chen, a calm, reassuring intellectual property lawyer from a top New York firm. David patiently walked him through the labyrinthine contracts, translating dense legalese into simple terms. He explained the publishing deal, the film options, the foreign rights. Alex signed where David told him to sign, his hands still feeling disconnected from the monumental act. Then came the financial advisors. A kind, silver-haired woman named Eleanor Vance was assigned to him. Her first task was to help him set up a bank account capable of receiving the initial wire transfer of the book advance. The number that appeared on his banking app a few days later was so long, so filled with commas, that it looked like a typo. He stared at it for a full 10 minutes, a quiet sense of vertigo washing over him. It was real. The news of the discovery began to ripple outwards. A trade publication, Publishers Weekly, ran a small article about the lost fantasy epic discovered by the author's grandson. From there, it was picked up by a larger news syndicate. The story was irresistible. A struggling single dad inherits a junk farm only to discover a literary goldmine. One headline, from a popular online news site, was particularly sensational. Farmhouse fortune. Grandfather's secret stories valued at staggering $120 million. That was the first time Alex had seen the number in print. David, his lawyer, had explained that this was a long-term projection, an estimated value of the entire intellectual property, book sales, film rights, merchandise, and potential sequels. It was a theoretical number, but it was a number that would now follow him for the rest of his life. His first priority wasn't a new car or a lavish vacation. It was the house. He didn't want to bulldoze it, as Henderson had suggested. This house wasn't just a shelter, it was a monument. It was his grandfather's studio, the birthplace of Ethelgard. It deserved to be honored. He hired a team of restoration experts, not just a construction crew. He found a local firm renowned for their work on historic homes. The lead architect, a man named Mr. Gable, walked through the house with an expression not of disdain, but of reverence. He saw the good bones beneath the rot, the handcrafted details, the soul of the place. Soon, the quiet farm was bustling with activity. Skilled craftsmen descended upon the property. They didn't just tear things down, they carefully removed, restored, and replaced. The sagging roof was completely rebuilt, its structure reinforced with new beams but finished with slate tiles that matched the original style. The warped porch was dismantled board by board, each plank numbered, before being reconstructed on a new, solid foundation. The broken windows were replaced with custom-milled sashes that fit the historic frames perfectly. Alex was there every day, not as a desperate laborer, but as a project manager, a guardian of his grandfather's vision. He made sure the oak writing desk was carefully protected and that the integrity of the study was maintained. He and Lily moved into a comfortable rental in the nearby town while the major work was being done. But they drove out to the farm almost every afternoon to watch the transformation. The change was astonishing. The skeleton was growing flesh and muscle. The ghostly gray wood was scraped, sanded, and painted a warm, welcoming cream color, with dark green trim on the windows and doors. The jungle of weeds was cleared, revealing the gentle, rolling contours of the land. A landscape architect designed a garden that was a mix of wild native plants and manicured flower beds, a tribute to both nature and nurture. Of course, the commotion did not go unnoticed by his neighbor. Mr. Henderson's daily routine of pruning his roses was now interrupted by the sounds of saws and hammers. He would stand at his pristine fence and watch the proceedings, his arms crossed, his face a mask of sour disbelief. He had watched Alex struggle and fail, and had taken a smug satisfaction in it. This new reality did not compute. The day the local newspaper ran a front-page story with a picture of Alex and the headline, "Local Man Inherits Literary Fortune," Henderson's worldview was shattered. He read the article, his mouth slightly agape, the numbers on the page seeming to mock his previous judgments. The next afternoon, Alex was at the farm inspecting the newly installed kitchen cabinets when he saw Henderson walking over the first time the man had ever set foot on the property. Henderson's usual confident stride was replaced by an awkward, hesitant shuffle. "Evans," he said, his voice stripped of its usual condescension. "Quite the operation you've got going here. House is looking good." He offered a tight, forced smile. Never would have guessed old Tom had it in him. "Guess you never know, huh?" "No," Alex replied politely, his victory needing no embellishment. "I guess you don't." The reversal was complete. The mocking neighbor was now a fawning admirer, his derision replaced by a desperate, transparent attempt to be included in the success he had so readily dismissed. Alex felt no anger, only a faint sense of pity. Henderson's world was small, defined only by what he could see on the surface. He would never understand the real treasure. With their immediate housing situation being handled, Alex turned to their other needs. He walked into a car dealership and paid cash for a brand new, safe, and reliable family SUV, a stark contrast to the dead pickup still sitting by the barn. The salesman, who had initially eyed Alex's simple clothes with suspicion, nearly fell over himself when Alex produced a debit card to pay the full amount. His next call was to Eleanor Vance, the financial advisor. "I want to set up a trust for my daughter," he said, the words feeling solid and powerful. "A college fund. More than that, a life fund. I want to make sure that she never has to make a choice based on money. I want her to be free to be whoever she wants to be." By the end of the day, the Lily Evans Trust was established, funded with an amount so significant that it guaranteed her security for the rest of her life. He had finally fulfilled the promise he had made to himself in the darkest hours of his city life. He had built a world for her, bigger and more wonderful than he had ever dreamed possible. One afternoon, standing on the newly finished porch and looking out over the transformed landscape, he felt a profound sense of peace. The money was a miracle, a tool that had changed everything. But as he looked at the house, his grandfather's house, their house, he knew the true price of the legacy wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in the love of a father for his daughter, the quiet genius of a forgotten old man, and the enduring, transformative power of a good story. A year can change everything. The farmhouse stood proudly on its rise, no longer a skeleton, but a warm, living home. The cream-colored paint glowed in the late afternoon sun, and the dark green shutters were open, as if the house itself were breathing in the sweet country air. The garden was a riot of color, a mix of manicured rose bushes and cheerful, chaotic wildflowers, a perfect fusion of order and wildness. A golden retriever, a boisterous and happy dog named Finn after a certain clever fox, chased a butterfly across the sprawling green lawn. Inside, the house was filled with light and the scent of lemon polish and old, beloved books. The study, once a dusty, forgotten corner, was now the heart of the home. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with everything from literary classics to modern thrillers. But the place of honor, on a specially built shelf above the oak writing desk, was reserved for a single volume, The Whispering Chronicles by Thomas Evans. The book had been a phenomenon. It debuted at #1 on the bestseller lists and stayed there for months, capturing the imaginations of children and adults around the globe. Critics hailed it as a modern classic, a masterpiece of world-building and heartfelt storytelling. The stern, reclusive man from the faded photograph was now celebrated as a literary genius. Alex sat at his grandfather's desk, though it was now his. He was on a video call, the faces of a small, dedicated board smiling back at him from his laptop screen. They were finalizing the details of the first round of grants. "And so, the board has approved the full funding for all 3 finalists," Alex said, a confident warmth in his voice that would have been unrecognizable a year ago. The Thomas Evans Foundation for Young Storytellers is officially open for business. He had found his new purpose. He was not a writer, but he was a guardian of writing. Using a portion of the book's earnings, he had created a foundation to support aspiring, undiscovered authors, the kind of quiet dreamers who, like his grandfather, might be creating magic in solitude. He was ensuring that other whispers would have a chance to be heard. After the call, he walked through the house, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. On the living room wall, a professionally restored and framed portrait of his grandfather now hung above the fireplace. The artist had captured the kindness in Thomas's eyes, the gentle soul hidden behind the stern exterior. Alex often found himself looking at it, having silent conversations with the man he had saved from obscurity. He found Lily not in the house, but in her favorite spot. A magnificent oak tree stood at the edge of the property, its branches spreading wide. Beneath it, a sturdy wooden swing had been hung. Lily sat on the swing, not moving, her head bent over a book. She was now 8 years old, and she read with a ferocious appetite. As Alex drew closer, he saw that the book in her hands was a well-worn copy of The Whispering Chronicles. He sat in the grass beside the swing. "Reading it again?" he asked with a smile. Lily looked up, her eyes bright. "It's my favorite part," she said. "It's where Finian finds the courage to go into the gnarled one's fortress, even though he's scared." "That's a good part," Alex agreed, looking out at their home, their life. The sprawling green lawn, the happy, bounding dog, the beautifully restored house that stood as a testament to a hidden genius. Across the road, Miss Henderson's house looked small and immaculate, a perfect but sterile diorama. They rarely spoke now, but Alex occasionally saw the man staring at their property with a look of perpetual, dumbfounded awe. Alex finally understood the full meaning of his grandfather's note, the one that had once been such a maddening riddle. The greatest treasures are not of gold, but of the heart and mind. The $120 million was a miracle. It had fixed their broken lives, given them security, and opened up a world of possibilities. But it wasn't the treasure, it was a byproduct of it. The real treasure was the story itself. It was the legacy of love and imagination, passed down through a dusty manuscript. It was the magic that had reconnected a grandson to the grandfather he never knew. It was the shared adventure that had forged an unbreakable bond between a struggling father and his hopeful daughter, giving them a common language of courage and wonder. He reached over and gently pushed Lily's swing. She glided into the air, her laughter mixing with the sound of the wind in the leaves of the great oak. Looking at her, at the home they had built, at the future stretching out before them, bright and limitless, Alex knew the truth. Mr. Henderson had been right about one thing he never would have guessed. No one could have. The quiet, eccentric old man in the junk farm had been, in every way that truly mattered, the richest man in the county. And now, so was Alex. The greatest fortunes aren't always found in a bank. Sometimes, they're found in a dusty attic, on a yellowed page, or in the boundless imagination of those we've misunderstood. The whispers of the past gave Alex and Lily a future, proving that the most valuable inheritance is a story waiting to be told. Thank you for joining us on Upstory. What do you think was the true treasure Alex's grandfather left behind? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We love reading your perspectives. And if you enjoyed this journey, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. We have many more stories to share with you. Until next time.